Oh, that's bitter. So a little over a year ago, last September, I went up to a lake house with a bunch of my friends. On our way there, we kind of kept joking about, like, what if Jason, because we were on a lake, was going to come out and kill us? You know, that like millennial humor. While at this cabin though, myself and the only other queer member of our group had decided that Jason was a queer icon. This solely was created because of that one scene in Freddy vs. Jason where Kelly Rowland's character tells Freddy he looks like a fag in his sweater, and then Jason swacks her and she dies. You know, gay rights. While we were being, definitely facetious, we weren't the first person to have come up with, a queer reading of the character Jason Voorhees. We also weren't the first group to ever really think about horror films through a queer reading. Lindsay Ellis, James Somerton, and Hazel are just a few other YouTubers who've addressed this kind of idea of queer horror. And I was kind of thinking, like, well, why is horror film so, gay? So in this video, I just kind of want to explore this subculture of like queer horror and kind of try to understand why queer people identify with the horror genre as well as, the villains of horror. And I kind of want to understand if there's, if we should still continue to feel this way. I really want to understand that relationship between horror and queer identities. Before we really get into this video, we're going to need to define some terms. That way we're all on the same level and understand, what we're talking about here. Let's start with a very popular one, and that's queer coding. So what is queer coding? Queer coding has a complicated history. To quickly define it, queer coding is when a character in a work of fiction is given attributes that we, as the audience, associate with queer identities. These characters are never confirmed queer within the story's canon, and actually might even go on living as a straight character would in the story. These traits that might be given to a character to code them as queer could be anything from an effeminate man who might live alone or with a single roommate, to a woman wearing a suit. Queer coding was originally created under the 1930s Hays Coding. Essentially what it was, the Hays Code decided what could and couldn't be put into films. Explicit violence, homosexuals, a lot of really, fun things were thrown out the window. Of course, films still were created with some of these, subject matter during this time. However, though, if you didn't meet the Hays Code, regulations, there was a good chance your movie might not be widely shown. As well as, it meant a lot of people were going to come after your film. So film creators, to get around this, they kind of created a shorthand for how to create queer characters. This once again started off as, just picking up on attributes that, the general society at large thought about when they thought of queer characters and queer people, and put them into the film. Even though these characters would never be confirmed queer, it was a way to talk about queer identities. However, it wasn't always done for good reasons. Often, and we see this still to this day, a lot of villains often have a lot of queer coding attached to them. We see this not just in movies, but we also see this in TV. We see this in Disney films. Anything from a James Bond villain can be coded as queer to, the Disney villains. Generally, we see the heroes in these stories more often than not are not queer coded themselves. And essentially what you need to get from this is not all characters who are coded queer are necessarily supposed to be read as queer. Sometimes it can be used as to kind of villainize them, use it as an insult, a joke, if you will. The one I like to think about is, Ursula from The Little Mermaid is based off of a drag queen. But it's not like they're saying drag is this great thing with that kind of messaging. If Ursula looks like a drag queen and Ursula is evil, then people might jump to the conclusion drag queens are evil. Another popular term that I think sometimes gets conflated with queer coding is queer baiting. But what is queer baiting? Queer baiting is a marketing technique for fiction and entertainment in which creators hint at but then do not actually depict same-sex romance or other queer representation. In these works, the characters will say or do something that we, the audience, code as queer. The difference here, though, is it's done in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way. Queerbaiting often occurs when a showrunner wants to capitalize off of a queer audience. I think the best example of queerbaiting in our modern media actually comes from the show Supernatural. I haven't watched it in quite a few years. I kind of gave up on it. But from what I remember and from what I can still tell from what audience members are saying is the characters Dean and Castiel are, highly shipped within that community, and the showrunners actually like to reference it. Of course, they'll never come out right and say that these characters are queer, nor will they actually state that they're not straight either. These characters, for all intents and purposes, are straight. And any nodding towards their fan relationship is solely for views, for money. You see here, queer baiting is never actually used as a form of representation, but rather to bring in money. Queer baiting is relatively new, and what it was is for a very long time, it was not at all, acceptable or even remotely worth putting in explicitly queer characters. So you had the queer coding here and there, but then as, queer rights became more prominent, people became more accepting, and it stopped being this kind of, it's badly viewed as it was, prior to like the 1990s. It started to become still not something you wanted to put on your TV show because, you'd risk, people freaking out, saying that you've sold out or that you're selling a bad message. So showrunners began to, queer bait. This idea once again coming from, okay, we have a prominent queer community, they're looking for representation. What if we give them representation? That way they'll watch our shows, we get money, and we capitalize off this, market of people who nobody wants to cater to. Of course, as we move away from the old ways and begin to accept, actual being accepting, we see that this doesn't come up as often as it used to, but it's still pretty prominent, and it's still a pretty, decent way for showrunners to, pull in those queer audiences and get that queer dollar. The last term I want to explore today, before we actually get into the meat of the video, the term is homoeroticism. I think a lot of people think they know what this term means, but what we're really going to be discussing it as a literary device. Homoeroticism is a sexual attraction between members of the same sex, but solely refers to desire and desire alone. Where homosexuality refers to more permanent identity, this solely is about desire. You see, while all homosexuals experience homoerotic desire, not everyone who experiences homoerotic desire are homosexual. Authors have often used homoeroticism as a tool to explore more intimate relationships between characters, even if these characters are, as far as the canon is concerned, are straight. Homoeroticism can be used as a metaphor for something deeper. Similar to queer coding, but it has less to do with traits and attributions that we as a society associate with queer people, and more about the depiction of desire. I think one of the best examples of homoeroticism actually comes from the show Hannibal. Now follow me for a second. As far as the narrative seems to be concerned, Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter are straight. I know season 3 of the show kind of blurs that a little bit more, but as far as really the world that they live in are concerned, these are heterosexual men. However, there is an intense desire between them. It goes so far that there are so many videos and blogs out there just dedicated to whether or not these characters are actually queer or not. However, though, I don't actually see this as necessarily a depiction of a queer relationship, but rather it's a metaphor for something a little bit deeper. This does not negate the fact that these characters are actually experiencing these feelings, or that, you know, we as the audience are picking up on them. But you see, the point of using the homoerotic desire here is not to depict a queer relationship. You see, the desire for each other seems to almost mirror the fact that Will is constantly chasing Hannibal, whether he knows it or not, and Hannibal is constantly playing this game of cat and mouse with him. You see, Will's trying to figure out who the killer is. Hannibal is the killer. So you see the relationship between them, while it has that homoerotic desire, it stands for something a little bit more metaphorical in a way. Once again, this doesn't negate the fact that these characters might have this kind of deep relationship and these romantic feelings or sexual feelings for each other, but in the context of the story, it's being used as a literary device for us, the audience, to really understand the tension that's going on underneath it all.
Is Hannibal in love with me?
Could he daily feel a stab of hunger for you and find nourishment at the very sight of you? Yes. But do you ache for him?
Now that we have these terms defined, we can actually start talking about the media I want to dissect. How I'm going to break this up, though, is I'm going to talk about 3 pieces of media, and along with it, some things that like relate or kind of help build up that case. The first 2 I'm going to talk about are kind of seen more as cult classics, big members in the queer subculture of horror. The last one we're going to talk about is fairly new and kind of very different than the rest. As we go through, we're going to be using these terms to kind of help understand what these films are about, and kind of help understand whether or not these films are kind of really deserving to be considered, you know, pieces of big, you know, queer cinema. Essentially, this video is just kind of, you know, looking at movies and going, but how gay? Part 1, The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is an interesting film because when I think of vampires, usually I don't think of like young, edgy biker gang. I usually think of, you know, like medieval, decrepit, old, you know, gross opulent, you know, Dracula. The Lost Boys is a 1987 black comedy horror film directed by Joel Schumacher. And while Joel Schumacher films tend to just have just a little too much camp and be way too over the top to really take serious, there's something about this film that actually works with it. The film tells the story of Michael, a teen boy who recently moves to San Carlos, California with his family and becomes entangled with a vampire leather gang. You know what queer kid hasn't had this fantasy? Michael is drawn by the only female member of the gang, Star, but quickly becomes entangled with the gang's leader, David. There's something odd about the relationship between these two, something that's just a little, too queer to not notice. Oddly enough, you would think the only female character in this entire movie, Star, would get a lot of attention from the other male vampire gang members or even from David, but as soon as Michael and David actually begin to interact, Star is pretty much relegated to barely a supporting role. The movie really focuses on David and Michael and their relationship. Michael follows David to the vampire hangout, where he then, ingests some of David's bodily fluids that then turn him into a vampire. It's a little gay. The film from there just even takes off more on the homoeroticism. You see, Michael and David, almost every interaction between them, it's very charged. There's this really erotic moment when David and the vampires take Michael to this bridge to hang. It's part of this almost like metaphorical transformation ceremony in some ways. And all the vampires let go of the bridge and fall off into this steam, this fog. It's very eerie and creepy. And Michael and David are the last two hanging on as the train goes over and they're hanging off this bridge. And David is yelling at Michael. And it's a little, well, to say a little is an understatement. It's very charged. It's, yeah. Even at the end of the film, when Michael and his friends have defeated all the vampires and are trying to kill David, David's goal doesn't seem to be to defeat Michael, but rather to have him join him. David is so fixated and obsessed with Michael. David, despite all of his allies having been slaughtered, is still focused on convincing Michael to surrender to the vampiric desires and join him. As a bro, of course. The sexual tension between Michael and David is by no means an odd or unheard of read. Actor Kiefer Sutherland, who played David, went on to say, "The whole scene where I catch Michael in the fog coming off the bridge, it's a very sensual moment." Cracked, who put The Lost Boys at number 5 on their top 5 most unintentionally gay horror movies, noted that some of the other elements of the film that we, the audience, would code as queer. After Michael drinks the blood of David and becomes a vampire, he begins to sport a single earring, much like the other male members of the vampire cult. While the single earring has now been appropriated into the culture at large and has been an accessory worn by many, at one point wearing a single earring was a discreet way that gay and lesbian people could allow other queers to know that they were not straight. It was a beacon in the night, if you will, so that other gays could know that you were one of them. Of course, now it's very vogue, alternative, and, straight people do it. And the occasional straight male celebrity will now wear an earring to prove that he's not riddled with toxic masculinity, because that's how that works. But Michael wearing and taking on the visual cues from David reads more as taking on queer garb than anything else. Author Harry Benshoff, in his book Monsters in the Closet, Homosexuality and the Horror Film, makes the claim that David's bleached blonde hair, leather attire, single earring, and his subtle stubble all seem to come from aesthetics that gay pinup models would wear. Speaking of David, there's something else we really need to address in the room here. Seeing as he's the leader of this group, a lot of his actions and the ways he dresses and will present define how the other members in the group will also. Often seen in gay media is the over-exaggeration, almost parody of masculinity. For example, Andy Warhol's The Lonesome Cowboy movie. The movie where there's a scene of cowboys wrestling and slowly stripping each other and themselves. Oh, Oh, and it's loosely based off of Romeo and Juliet. Either way, there tends to be a using of parodying of hypermasculinity in gay spaces, from men dressing up as cowboys and in all leather at gay bars, Andy Warhol taking hypermasculine sports like wrestling and making them queer. David and the other vampires have to perform masculinity. It's not uncommon in the vampire media and trope for vampires have to perform like humans. They have to perform what it means to be human. It's pretty common because a vampire is no longer human. They've lost a lot of their connections, emotions, and what it means to be a human. So they have to perform it in a way. However, in his book, The Vampire Film, Undead Cinema, author Jeffrey Weinstock argues that David and the other vampires perform masculinity, and that performance is so exaggerated it becomes parody. Once again, adding another element of the queer reading of this film. Now I guess it comes time to answer the question for all the fangirls in the room. Is this film gay? Or is it queer coding? Is it queer baiting? What would we categorize this film, and how should we look at it to better understand it? I like to think of this film actually falling into the example of homoeroticism. Not only are these characters canonically, to my knowledge at least, straight, I think the erotic desire between Michael and David, not so much an extension of romance, but, well, competition. Michael moves to a fairly flamboyant town and sticks out because he is not flamboyant himself. And even though he's interested in fitness and motorcycles, it doesn't come off as parody like it does with David. Furthermore, he moves into town and becomes infatuated with Star, and Star is interested in him as well. This mutual interest leads to David actually noticing Michael in the first place. Is it this desire that they both share for the same person, the cause that leads them to become so obsessed with each other? You see, the competition between them becomes very, noticeable. David has to perform his masculinity, and it comes off like a character from an Andy Warhol film. While it comes naturally to Michael in the beginning of the film, David and Michael at the beginning of the film are not infatuated with each other, but rather are in competition. This wouldn't be the first time that we are able to apply a queer reading in talking about homosexuality with vampires. Vampires and their desire for blood, well, as you know, can often be written in a very erotic and sensual way. And even then, it's not usually like a wholesome, romantic kind of love. It's perverted. Let's take a quick look at Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. In the novel, Jonathan Harker sets out to meet Dracula, who is looking to buy property in London. After the business deal is finalized, Jonathan realizes he is not Dracula's guest, but now his prisoner. When Dracula's 3 brides attempt to seduce and feast on Jonathan, Dracula rescues him. Dracula tells his wives, "He belongs to me." Once again, is the homoerotic desire here our version of the homoerotic desire literary device, or is it something more? We, of course, have more explicit examples, like Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. But with Dracula and the Lost Boys, that eroticism seems to stem from a desire, but some kind of other form. Much like the Lost Boys, there seems to be an infatuation that both Dracula and Jonathan have for the story's main female, Mina. It's often seen that Dracula's obsession with Mina is that it gives him the ability to spy on those plotting his destruction. There's also, though, some erotic undertones here. Vampires are often a symbol of sex, but not just any sex symbol. They're representative of some kind of forbidden desire. Something that feels good, but is bad for you. Something you're not supposed to give into. Something you're supposed to reject. Professor Talia Scaffer points out in her article, A Wild Desire Took Me, the homoerotic desire of Dracula, that Stoker began writing Dracula as a response to Oscar Wilde's trial and conviction of sodomy. Schaffer argues Dracula was a response to the fear Stoker felt regarding the events involving Wilde in his trial. Scholars like Schaffer have speculated for years that Stoker and Wilde may have been in a secret relationship. Schaffer suggests that Stoker may have been so obsessed with trying to keep his sexuality hidden, as seen in the letters that he wrote to his known lovers, that he may have also had a romance with Wilde and may have begun to refer to him in their relationship in code in the letters and correspondences with Wilde and their colleagues. The inspiration, though, for the novel is not so far-fetched, though. You see, Stoker and Wilde both had interest in the same woman. Ultimately, though, it was Stoker who would marry her. The drama revolving the relationship and everything that went down could very honestly been an inspiration for the relationships between Mina, Dracula, and Jonathan. This brings up a really interesting question, though, for both the novel and real life. Were Stoker and Wilde having an attraction to each other because they were both attracted to the same woman? Or were they both attracted to the same woman because they were attracted to each other? And then we can take that and apply that question also to Jonathan and Dracula, which the text does kind of suggest that it could go either way. I have to take these out. Fake teeth are not fun, kids. Being a vampire is a lot harder than it looks. While the homoeroticism read is not the only read we can get when looking into The Lost Boys, it is by far the most relevant to this conversation. We could also read into David and Michael's relationship as something maybe more sinister and predatory, but for now I'm just going to table that. But the thing about the homoeroticism as a literary device is that it doesn't inherently mean that we can't read David as a queer character. Same with Dracula. However, it's important to understand that the attraction here goes beyond the erotic and becomes something metaphorical. This next point might seem irrelevant, but hold on. In the book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, the story follows the character of Chang'ez, who is an immigrant from Pakistan to the US. Follows his story from living in America pre-9/11 to post-9/11 and how, overnight, essentially, America changed. In the story, he has a blossoming relationship with a girl named Erica. The thing here, though, is we could consider this an erotic relationship in the sense that, they do care for each other. But there's something more to that relationship when we talk about the text, and that's that Erica is a metaphor for America. And not just America, but also his desire to achieve his American dream. His love for her is his yearning for America. When she ultimately kills herself, that's when Chang'ez begins to realize that his American dream and Muslim faith are not compatible in a post-9/11 world. So you see here, we can use eroticism to talk about bigger concepts. And that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about homoeroticism as a literary device. It doesn't negate the fact that we can still view these characters as being, queer. It just means, though, that there's something else there that the author wants us to get to. And that's kind of what I think the intention between The Lost Boys and Dracula are. That eroticism between the main characters, while it can definitely be read at face value, it's just, eroticism, I think it's supposed to stand for something a little bit deeper and talk about some other issues. Dracula is not just the representation of, the fear of being caught. Dracula is also the representation of how, Stoker felt being a closeted homosexual. So you can walk away with this movie, going, oh, David definitely had a thing for Michael. So it's important to understand here that homoeroticism and eroticism can be used as a metaphor, essentially, going a little bit deeper than just that face value read. you can use it as a way to understand the text and the motivations behind the text. You know, what do we take away from the relationship between Michael and David? You know, David's definitely obsessed with Michael, but for what reason? You know, there's the reading of, okay, is there erotic charge behind them related to that they're both competing for the same girl? You know, while that read could work, you know, David doesn't really seem that interested in Star. You know, another one that I think is a little bit more compelling is David wants to be what Michael is, in the sense that he performs his masculinity without trying. It comes a little bit more naturally to him because he isn't so detached from his humanity. So while I do think, you know, we can say, yeah, David did have a thing for Michael, we also have to understand what's the underlying reason for it and how does that relate to the text. The Lost Boys overall is an odd film. I don't think it really sets out to do maybe everything it tried to. Some of the metaphors, I think, get a little lost. This is a Joel Schumacher film after all. But, you know, it's something to consider when we start to analyze these films with a queer eye. It's also wondering, are we supposed to? There's some people who argue that you're not supposed to because, you know, the film doesn't explicitly state these characters as queer. But the film, after all, though, was directed by a gay man, so.
Part 2, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. The only notes I had for when it came to thinking about costuming for this video was Freddy Krueger, but make it fashion. And I don't think I completely failed, but I don't think I succeeded either. So here we go. The original Nightmare on Elm Street is known for being one of the scariest movies ever created. And if we're gonna be honest, it was supposed to be a lot more horrifying, believe it or not. However, though, the sequel, Freddy's Revenge, is known for something a little bit more different. Like I said, if the first film is known for being one of the scariest horror films ever created, Freddy's Revenge is known for being one of the, gayest movies ever created. The movie follows Jesse, who moves into Nancy Thompson's house 5 years after the events of the first film. Jesse is shy and obvious and very, very uncomfortable with his sexuality. Whether he's gay, bisexual, or some other variation of queer is never definitively stated, but it's obvious he's not straight. Rather than trying to kill Jesse, Freddy's goal is to possess him and use him to kill people, seeing as he was defeated in the first movie and now needs another way to find his victims. So Freddy is trying to get inside of Jesse. Yeah, you can take a second and unpack that. But seriously, this movie is very heavy on the queer tones. Jesse's struggle with his sexuality almost seems to be manifesting in Freddy. Jesse has a dream about going to a gay bar where his coach shows up in all leather and makes him run laps at the gym for just like being at the bar. Later, that coach is killed by Freddy. Yeah, interesting. The more Jesse seems to struggle with his sexuality, the more Freddy seems to take over. As his friend and eventual savior, Lisa, begins to show interest in him, we see this kind of sends Jesse off, causing him to freak out. And not just like kind of freak out, but freak out more than he does about anything else. Like, the guy has a dream that his coach finds him at a gay bar, kind of hits on him, and then forces him to run laps, and that then he's murdered, to find out the next day that his gym teacher was murdered. And now he's having all these like reoccurring dreams about Freddy, and he's like walking around naked at night. Yet he seems to be more freaked out about Lisa putting the moves on him. There's something to be said here. A lot of the queer text in this film is supposedly subtext. The movie never explicitly states that Jesse is queer, but when you're having dreams about leather gay bars and waking up all hot and bothered in your underwear, well, it's not exactly coded as straight either. However, the film does make sure that we know that Lisa and Jesse do end up together. The movie is interesting not just because of how it explores sexuality as like this idea of the monster in the closet, but the movie seems to flip typical gender norms as well. Some have claimed that this is kind of another way that the movie kind of gets queered. I'm not super, convinced of that, but I do think it makes an interesting conversation, to say at the bare minimum. In this movie, Jessie is kind of introduced to us as our, final girl. The final girl is a trope in the horror genre where one character, usually a young woman, acts as both the main protagonist and is the last character standing. This character usually vanquishes the villain herself, but sometimes can be assisted by another character. It's important that the villain here, though, has been taunting the final girl the most, usually from the beginning. Often we see with final girls is these ideas of purity, being kind of morally above their friends who all get murdered. Just great messages for those youths at home. Examples of final girls would include Nancy Thompson from the first Nightmare on Elm Street, Sidney Prescott from Scream, and Laurie Strode from Halloween. However, at the film's climax, the role of final girl kind of goes from Jessie to Lisa. Lisa, though, in some ways also can not only be read as the new final girl of the film, but seen as the typical male hero that's seen in a lot of earlier films that comes in and saves the damsel in distress. So Lisa takes on the masculine role and Jessie takes on the damsel in distress, usually a feminine role. I mean, we often saw this trope in the early Scooby-Doo cartoon, so it's not an unheard of idea, but it's definitely new here when you have the gender swap. There's definitely something a little queer. It's not just myself, though, who's noted this kind of queer reading to the film. The movie made #1 on Crack's top 5 most unintentionally gay horror films. The article even notes, there's nothing logical can explain the level of homoeroticism in this movie. Rumor has it that the main part was originally written for a girl, but that doesn't even come close to covering it. In the book, Welcome to Our Nightmares, author Jason Norman argues for the queer reading of this film. He writes, the film suggested an undertone of homosexuality, starting with the protagonist's gender-neutral name. Jesse's rarely fully clothed. Him and his tormentor have a sweaty wrestling match. His coach, clad in leather, basically hits on him in a gay bar and then gets killed by Freddy, including a bare-ass spanking. It's not just critics and film analysts, though, that have picked up on this kind of queer reading. Robert Englund, the actor for Freddy in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, told Attitude magazine, the second Nightmare on Elm Street is obviously intended as a bisexual-themed film. It was the early 80s, pre-AIDS paranoia. Jesse's wrestling whether to come out or not in his own sexual desires was manifested by Freddy. His friend is the object of his affection. That's all there in that film. The script's author, David Chaskins, however, maintains that the film's queerness was mostly supposed to be very subtle queer subtext. He maintains that it was never supposed to be as explicit as many says it is. He even went on to say that Mark Patton, the actor of Jesse, and his interpretations of Jesse were choices that he made. I have to believe that he got it, and that he decided to play it. In other words, he believes that his script was very nuanced and wasn't very in your face, and that the queer subtext was very, very subtle. And that the reason this film, gets known as the queerest one in the franchise is solely because of Mark Patton, the gay actor who played Jesse. So he blames the actor for how his film was presented and not anything to do with his script. Interesting. Mark Patton has responded to these claims of subtext with, "I love when he uses the word subtext. Did you actually go to a freshman English course in high school? This is not subtext." What does this mean, though, for our conversation? Is this queer baiting? Is this queer coding? Is this homoeroticism? I personally don't really see it as homoeroticism because it's, just about Jesse, and it's not about his necessarily relationship with anyone. And we also see here, the metaphor here is what Freddy stands for. It's not necessarily queer baiting because there probably wasn't a really big enough audience to justify that. Until fairly recently, studios did not care about, pandering to the LGBT, community. So it's safe to assume it's not going to be queer baiting here. Going along with the history of queer coding that we see in the early 20th century films, I believe this film kind of falls more in line with that. The movie never states that Jesse is queer. Therefore, Freddy, as a manifestation of Jesse struggling with his sexuality, is a conclusion that we can come to if we, want to make that claim. But, it can easily be refuted by people pointing out that Jesse ends up with Lisa. But that still doesn't mean there's no inherent, some kind of variation of queer here. This wouldn't be the first time that we see in the history of horror that queer identities are kind of used and explored within this genre to talk about how they manifest. We of course could, bring this back to Dracula, but I also want to talk about another very popular Gothic novel, that being Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. The novel follows Dorian Gray, a young, attractive socialite in Victorian London who finds himself involved with an artist Basil and his friend Lord Henry. Lord Henry and Basil both desire for Dorian, though it's more for his legs than anything, of substance. For Basil, Dorian is the perfect muse for his art, and Lord Henry, well, he's gay and old. Lord Henry is the only one who seems to make Dorian aware of the fact that he is solely desired for his looks, and through his endless philosophizing, Dorian begins to really grasp that he solely is desired for his only looks, and that his beauty is ultimately fleeting. This causes him to panic. It doesn't help that Lord Henry puts the idea in Dorian's head also that sin and knowledge make you ugly. I also feel like Lord Henry believes this only because he views himself as being very intelligent, and he knows that he himself is not very attractive. But hey, I could be wrong. Maybe all of this is from all the sin and knowledge. And much like when Eve ate the forbidden fruit and suddenly lost her innocence, Dorian loses his sense of innocence as well in this moment. In a bargain he makes with the powers that be, he wishes that the portrait would age instead of him, and that he would remain youthful, therefore desirable. Within gay spaces, it's very common for youthfulness to be a desired trait. The younger you are and the younger you look, the more you're gonna be, sought after. Of course, this isn't just true for, within the gay community. It's affected the gay community in much different ways. In 2013, it was reported that more gay men went under. In 2013, it was noted that more gay men under 30 underwent Botox and other low-invasive cosmetic surgery than ever before. In 2020, it was reported that more gay men over the age of 30 were beginning to engage more with cosmetic surgeries like Botox and other low-invasive surgeries solely to keep their careers alive, citing that they believed that the reason they could, keep their careers going on for a few more decades was slowly based on how they looked. Many of them cited that they believed how the way gay men move through, society and business was more dependent on their looks than for their straight male counterparts. The thing here is, much like Jesse, Dorian seems to be either in denial or struggling with his sexuality. He obviously enjoys the attention he gets from Basil and Lord Henry. Dorian was even briefly engaged to an actress, but his love for Sybil was solely for her ability to act and not much for her in any other capacity. It's just very obvious that he's more interested into the idea of her maybe than actually in her. It reminds me a lot of the relationship between Coverdale and Zenobia in the Blithedale romance, for anyone who's read that. His desire to be youthful and desirable also can never be satisfied because of his rejection for his sexuality. You see, if your goal is to constantly be desirable and to be loved, if you never, allow yourself to open up to someone you can actually love and want to be with, well, you're never going to actually satisfy that desire. It doesn't matter how young you keep yourself, how youthful you may appear. And this is ultimately one of Dorian's major issues. Basil, whose love for Dorian goes a tad beyond the surface, begs Dorian to pray for salvation when he discovers how hideous the portrait has become. Basil, who actually does care for Dorian and his love for him does, go beyond the surface level. I'm not sure how much he actually knows Dorian and cares for his him on a, I guess, maybe personal level, but he does want to keep, Dorian alive, and he definitely wants his soul to be saved. But you see, he begs him, pray to salvation. Dorian, however, in turn, decides to kill Basil. You see, with Basil, Dorian always had the opportunity to kind of satisfy his physical desires. Basil, adored Dorian for how he looked, while Lord Henry was putting in his head all these ideas of aging and the fleeting of beauty. Basil was just so much more, in love with Dorian. I'm not sure if he was more in love with the idea of him, but, he, didn't really seem to be that caught up with maybe the idea of the fleeting of age. And as we see here, he does seem to care for Dorian's, at least eternal soul, even if, maybe his desire for him is more physical and maybe based less on, who he actually is, but it's more than what we get from Lord Henry. So Basil represents something that Dorian could have had, but Dorian, he rejects that part of him. He doesn't, open up to being actually attracted to men. As we see, he gets engaged to Sybil. He indulges himself in kind of this hedonistic lifestyle, all in order to kind of, how I saw it, to distract himself from who he really was. I think this is also part of the reason he becomes so obsessed with his looks. This idea of repressing one's sexuality until it boils over and manifests something into bigger, well, is not unheard of. So essentially here what we're getting at is we don't need necessarily for this example to explicitly tell us that, our main character, Jesse, is, some variation of queer. The subtext isn't very subtext. But what's interesting here is the story would read so much different, and I think reads very different for people who don't read it through a queer lens. I don't think they really understand what, Freddy in this version of the story stands for, because Freddy in the sequel is a much different Freddy than the first one. And I think it has to solely do with that idea of what he's representing here. And I think that's the true with a lot of horror monsters is they don't need to have very explicitly stuck personalities. They can represent multiple things because, monsters to all of us can mean something different. We all fear the boogeyman, but for different reasons. Many people fear Freddy. In the first movie, he's a metaphor for that fear that was going on in the 80s where a lot of children were being taken. But also in the 80s was the fear a lot of, gay men and gay women felt with what it meant to come out, especially with the AIDS crisis just around the corner. Part 3. The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Boo! This is quite the look, isn't it? I was trying to go chic ghost, and this is this kind of like discount bargain version, I guess. If only you could see the disappointment on my face.
The following piece of media that we will be discussing today is 2020's The Haunting of Bly Manor. This was the highly anticipated follow-up to 2018's The Haunting of Hill House.
Through this anthology series, each season kind of follows its own, ghost story, as it begins to explore some kind of deeper topics as well. This season was inspired by works by Henry James.
The story follows a young au pair as she takes a job watching 2 children at a very old and creepy manor known as Bly Manor in the countryside of England. While there, though, she begins to experience some supernatural occurrences.
Danny, our au pair, seems to be haunted herself, though. Before coming to the haunted manor, she is followed by a spectral being with large moon-like eyes. This spectral figure seems to be spotted in mirrors, seeming to cause Danny a lot of distress, though we are not privy to the reasoning of this haunting much later into the season. As the events of the main haunting begin to unfold with faceless spirits and possession, more and more hints are left for us. Flora, one of the children Danny watches, finds these glasses in her belongings, very similar to the spectral's eyeglasses. Of course, though, when she sees them, Danny is less scared and just more distressed and upset, and actually needs to excuse herself from the room, being visibly moved in a very negative way by these glasses. In a flashback, we eventually learn that the ghost is more or less of an actual ghost and more of a manifestation of Danny's guilt. This specter is Danny's deceased fiancé, Edmund, and those are not moons, but traffic lights reflecting off of his glasses. Danny was engaged to Edmund, but when she came clean about her sexuality, being attracted to women, not actually men, this led to a fight between the two, and Edmund quickly got out of the car and jumped right into traffic without really looking. There he is struck by an oncoming truck. Danny sees the specter in the hospital shortly after Edmund's passing. This is why Danny leaves for England in the first place and ends up at Bly. When on the phone with her mother, Danny claims she's not running from anything. But she is. She's constantly seeing Edmund's reflection in different mirrors and out of the corner of her eyes. The glasses highlighted by the oncoming lights from the traffic. It's very haunting and quick looks, but the more you watch it and start to think about it afterwards, that it's revealed that it's not really a ghost, just more of a manifestation of her guilt, it all starts to make more sense. You see, all Danny has to do is turn away from the mirror or quickly close, like if it's like a medicine cabinet, for example, for it to go away. This kind of becomes a big issue a little bit later in the first episode, or it might be the second, I believe it's the first, where Danny actually gets locked into Flora's cupboard. And when locked in there, she sees Edmund's reflection in a mirror, causing her, once again, great distress. It's less of fear and less about, this kind of like primal fight or flight kind of reaction, but more of just like it causes her great despair and stress and anxiety. You see here, Danny feels guilty.
Edmund constantly showing up in mirrors, looming just over her shoulder, is a manifestation of her guilt. Her guilt for hurting Edmund, and ultimately, she blames herself for his death. Edmund had loved Danny since they were kids, and Danny wanted to love him back. She really did. For the first half, Danny seems to struggle with her past and guilt, and we see the specter on and off. Danny seems to avoid mirrors, attempting to cover them as she sees them, especially when Edmund is in them. Like I said before, unlike the other very real ghosts in the story, the specter becomes very obvious to not be real, but that doesn't mean his effects are any less, important or, traumatizing. However, as Danny's relationship with Jamie and the gardener blossoms, we see fewer and fewer intense moments with Edmund's ghost. But as Danny begins to accept this, she puts and lays to rest the glasses. Edmund's specter seems to pass. From the point on when Danny burns the glasses, we never see the specter again. There's something interesting to me about the manifestation of a ghost as a metaphor for guilt in a story where ghosts actually exist. Not only does it blur the line between reality and fiction in that universe, but it makes the other ghosts seem more real, even if the reason for this haunting can be dissected into metaphor and, understandings in that way as well. However, though, there's something with Edmund's specter that is extremely haunting on its own. But I think the realness of Edmund's presence, whether it's in Danny's head or not, speaks to guilt that many gay people feel prior to coming to terms with their sexuality. A 2014 report from professors at the University of Buffalo explored how gay men, lesbian, women, and bisexual people are more likely to abuse substances due to guilt they feel over their sexuality. The Center for American Progress in 2012 reported that roughly 20 to 30% of LGBT people in the US abuse substances compared to the 9% of the entire general public. In 2015, the CDC reported that queer teens are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. While many resources focus on discrimination and homophobia, it's important to discuss the guilt one feels about their sexuality before coming to terms with it. Researchers for the Journal of Adult Development explored in their article, Are Gay Men in Worse Mental Health Than Heterosexual Men?, the role of age, shame, and guilt in coming out. How staying in the closet and concealing a part of their identity is linked with shame, guilt, and the mental health of gay men that they studied. Essentially, when you're gay, you feel like you're constantly lying. The cultural default that we have for most people is to assume they're straight. And as you begin to grow and learn kind of those attributes that we identify with, straight and queer people, it starts to become more obvious, for many people, what they are or aren't. However, though, a lot of people, since the default on them for the longest time has been to assume they're straight, they have a hard time coming to terms with their sexuality. And, by the time they even start to realize what they may or not be, a large chunk of their life has gone by. And then they start feeling like they've been lying to their loved ones. So to protect yourself, you conceal. Because we often learn that many attributes we identify with queer identities as well are seen as bad. How Danny had to conceal her desire for women for so long. There's a reason many queer people say that they feel like there's a weight that's been lifted off of them once they come out. Because even if it was in order to fit in or to protect yourself, they felt like they were living a lie. Danny's story is the odd one out. It's the only one where the character is explicitly stated as queer. However, just like every other character mentioned, we see how her relationship with her sexuality manifests into horror. Much like for Jesse, Freddy was the manifestation of his fears. I guess Michael and David don't fit in quite as well, which is why I don't see their relationship as being really anything more than like the homoeroticism that we discussed. However, though, Danny being explicitly stated queer makes elements of the subtext far more interesting than it does if it were implied. It makes it a lot more interesting to discuss than some of these past examples. Her specter would have taken on new meaning if Danny had not been clearly stated as queer. It's like how if we say Jesse is 100% straight, without a doubt, a lot of the messaging only in that film gets really confusing. But it also changes so much about what we understand about the movie. When a piece of media explicitly states a character as queer, it will inherently affect the story and how it progresses. Whether we want to admit it or not, being gay or straight will affect how one develops and becomes socialized in the world. Therefore, it will play a role in how they make choices, how they react, and how their stories will ultimately unfold.
So why does any of this matter? Outside of The Haunting of Bly Manor, none of these examples actually include explicitly queer characters. So why is it that so many queer people identify with the horror genre and characters from horror movies? And the thing is, when we are depicted in the horror genre, we're often one of the first characters to go, or there's some kind of punishment that's related to the fact that, that they're queer. I think there's a good handful of reasons why queer people tend to identify with horror, but I think the most interesting and most relevant here has to do with the fact that, well, many of the villains in horror movies, like we've stated before, tend to appropriate a lot of the attributes our society identifies as being queer. So a lot of these characters are in some ways queer-coded, or the stories rely on some kind of queer reading in some ways. It's one of the few places where we can actually see any kind of reading that's for queer people. It seems to be a little concerning that most of the characters who are actually, queer-coded tend to be villains. And this is not just in horror, but in horror it adds a whole nother level. To bring it back to Jason for a second, the guy's got mommy issues, and what's more queer than having some kind of parental issue, as well as sometimes he holds that machete in such a phallic way. Okay, but let's get real here for a second. I'm just being facetious. There are some examples that we can actually look at. Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street often is quite flamboyant. He's got a weird flair for the dramatic. He's like a gay on Halloween. But the thing here is, I don't know about you, but I personally don't really want to identify with Freddy. He's kind of gross.
How sweet. Dark.
There's something about Dracula that, just reads so queer. And it's not just his attraction for Jonathan, but it's also that flair for the dramatic once again, how flamboyant he can be, the way, he talks about the people. There's something very obviously not super straight about him. And once again, it's, well, as much as I love vampires, do I want to be Dracula? But there's also something there in the reading that hits home in some ways that not everyone can really understand. That idea of being a social outcast because of something you can't control. You have this hunger, this desire, and the only way to satisfy it is to do something that's been deemed, bad. I don't think feeding on humans is quite, how do you say, normal? As we also mentioned with David, his performance of masculinity and his aesthetic is so over the top, it's, beginning to become parody, much kind of like, the Andy Warhol films, and the way a lot of characters are quoted as queer. You see here, there is an aesthetic, and the more masculine you get, and the more parody it becomes, the less straight it is. And once again, that's something a lot of straight people, especially from a specific generation, can really identify with. Jesse from Nightmare on Elm Street 2 doesn't have to be explicitly stated queer for many of us to identify with him. There's just something about the idea of our shame, manifesting in some pretty negative and harmful ways in our mental health is something a lot of queer people can understand and get that reading from the movie. And I'm not saying straight people can't identify with some of these attributes, but there's something about them that just tends to feel more, queer. I think there's a reason a lot of my straight friends tend to identify with the protagonists in a lot of horror movies. They say, oh, I like Nancy. Oh, I like Sydney. They identify with certain characters, but often I see myself more portrayed in, the villains. We can understand what it's like for Jason to be mocked and ridiculed and bullied for something outside of our control, and to, be nearly killed for it, and many are killed for it. When I say Jason's a queer icon, of course I'm being facetious, but there is a reading there that, strikes home just a little. You see, we see ourselves in vampires because we know what it's like to be the social outcast. We know what it's like to have to conceal a part of our identity. You can't go around saying you're a vampire or, Van Helsing's, But we also understand how strong that desire can be. That way to feel, complete. We understand Frankenstein's monster because we know what it's like to be rejected for something outside of your control, specifically by your creator, your parent. Frankenstein's monster, all he wants is to be understood and for love. And that's rejected by him from the person who created him. A narrative a lot of queer people can identify with. You see, so many queer people identify with horror and characters in horror, and have for so long because, we've been denied our representation in the mainstream movies for so long. We see that finally changing, and I definitely see there seems to be less younger queer people who seem to identify with horror less, even though I don't think some of the current queer movies are the best. But so many queer people still identify with that monster in the closet. They see themselves as it because not only have they been denied the representation, but they've lived as that monster in the closet. They've lived with that guilt, that horror. They understand what it means to be that. We understand what it's like to be ostracized from society, and when people figure out us in our true identity, the mobs are going to come for us. And just when things were starting to feel like they're getting better, we have 2 Supreme Court justices here in the United States that want to roll back a lot of the queer rights. And the same can be said for the presidential administration in power right now. You see, for some reason, even in 2020, we're being demonized. Even though the large part of the public seems to be fine and accepting of us, we're still the monster in the closet. We haven't been accepted fully. While I don't think it's completely immoral to see yourself as the monster in a movie, like I said, I'm pretty sure the point of a lot of horror movies, especially good ones that are written well, is you should kind of sometimes sympathize with the villain sometimes. You don't maybe agree with what they're doing, but Frankenstein's monster, for example, you kind of sympathize with him. You feel for him. You understand his pain. Yeah, he's committed a lot of crimes and is a disgrace against, nature and whatnot. You still sympathize with him on some level. And I think this is the same for a lot of these same monsters. And I think that's kind of why, at the core, We identify with it. We see ourselves. We understand there's a part of ourselves we can't control. Yet, we are victimized because of it. But it doesn't always feel great identifying with them. For example, to bring it back to Dracula, attempts to seduce both men and women. And I think, that can be empowering to someone. However, his attempt at seduction is perverted. Unlike a bisexual or pansexual or, fluid person, who wants to pursue someone, regardless of their gender, for, romance or physical intimacy, Dracula wants to do it in order to feast upon them. And while there definitely is some kind of sexual gratification for him, and even potentially for the person he's feeding on, it's not good. It's specifically written as something bad and deviant. And when that's one of the few examples you can really pick from off the top of your head is, representation of maybe your own queer identity, well, that doesn't feel great. Great, even Dracula thinks I'm a monster. And the thing is, at the core of it, until recently, I guess you could say, most vampires weren't really the most aspirational to go after. I think we all have a thing for Lestat, but I mean, the man's a mess. And of course, the examples of the vampires that are good, morally good, I guess you could say, Twilight, and trust me, I'm a Twilight fan at heart, but they're all straight. They're not gonna let me in their club. Queer people ultimately have a very complex history and relationship with horror. Horror is one of the few places we can actually see ourselves represented. Rarely, though, the characters we identify with, though, are given the space to be more than the villain that needs to be vanquished, the monster under the bed, the ghoul in the closet. As a horror fanatic, this was actually a super fun video to research and write for. I love analyzing, and it was really fun to think about horror and this kind of queer eye, if you could say. However, I don't feel very great at the end of it, because mostly I'm walking away with just, well, even in my favorite genre, when I can identify with someone on screen, they're gonna be vanquished and seen as a monster. So all I guess I have to really wrap this video up with is, well, happy Halloween.